why don't you take a seat and tell me what appears to be the problem? Welcome to another exciting new episode of Consult the Doctor. I'm going to talk about 4 questions that I have received, and I thought all 4 of these were very interesting questions, ranging from pragmatic to philosophical and everything in between, so I love that. Let's get started straight away. Richard asks, can you explain the use of shims? I'm paraphrasing a bit, don't tines close up again? Are there alternatives that aren't metal? Okay, so what are we talking about? We're talking about brass shims that look like this. Pieces of this is a reasonable size. I don't know what exactly the history of these is, but if you're not familiar with this and you think, what the hell are those? Let me give you the history that I'm familiar with. I learned about these through Richard Binder, who used to sell them on his website before he retired, famous Nipmeister. And he also sold some pen repair products, and these are among them. Now, what are they? Brass, okay, and they're shims. They're little pieces of brass. Now, from what I understood is, he recommended at some point that if you don't want to buy the shims from him, because he would sell them in about a 1-inch square. That sentence ended there, in a 1-inch square. And he said something at that point, but if you don't want to buy that, there is a company called K&S, I think it was K&S, Railroad Supplies. It's for model trains, and they make these things because people use these in the electronics that go into that hobby. Okay. They come in 4 thicknesses in a pack that K&S Railroad Supplies sold, and those shims were about this size. So you know, the notebook, like about the size of one of these pages. And they were 0.0001, 0002, 0003, and 0005 of an inch. And the idea is you take out a nib from a pen, so you're holding just the nib. You put one of these corners through the breather hole, and then you gently pull it through, and that flosses the nib. And Mr. Binder recommended two thicknesses for that, as the very thin 0.0001, which is indeed very thin, to kind of floss the nib. Probably shouldn't touch my mouth after that. And then there is the 0.0002, which he used to increase the gap between the tines of a nib. So why do you use this? Very simply, to enhance the flow of a fountain pen. Remember that if the 2 tines are too close together, that pen will be very dry. If there is the tiniest gap between them, this is an exaggeration, if there's the tiniest gap between them, ideally one that, in my mind, that kind of tapers toward the end, but is still a little open, just a little bit open at the end, you'll have a wetter flow, a richer flow. If the tines are splayed out, so if that gap looks like this, away from the breather hole, then you have a problem, because that actually hampers capillary action. So again, the idea is stick them in and just run them through a couple of times very gently, and that opens up the gap between the tines. Now, that was as brief as I could make that explanation. I hope that is clear. The very good question is, yeah, but don't those tines just close up again? You run it through and they snap shut, and you run it through, they snap shut. With enough runs, I have found that you can open them up a bit, and I've experimented a bit on very cheap nibs where I kind of wiggled. So I put in the shim, and then I kind of wiggled a little bit, and that seemed to work. I think the advantage of this technique is that you can't do a whole lot wrong, especially if you're just running the shims through the nib slit. That wiggling stuff, I probably wouldn't recommend that. That was just me being a little impatient, trying to speed up the process. So it's a conservative technique. And what I remember from Richard Binder's side is that he actually explains that you really don't need much of an increasing gap to increase the ink flow a little bit. So like running it through that slit 3 times, that's not going to do it. But running it through that slit a number of times will open up those tines enough to have a little bit of a difference. I have found since then that there are other ways to do it. that I find a little bit more effective that do not involve a shim at all. By far, and that is the second part of the question, are there alternatives? Because yes, it is, frankly, of course, you're rubbing metal on metal. Is there anything that is a little less harsh? Some people, and this is the old school technique, but I know of at least one person who knows an incredible amount about pens who does it that way. People use razor blades, jam those through. That is, I feel, sometimes frowned upon because these shims are not particularly sharp. I can run my finger across it. Probably shouldn't do it with too much pressure, but I can run my finger across it and don't have a cut. Obviously, if you do that with a razor blade, you may need stitches. So that can actually shave off parts of the inside of a nib, and that's what you want to avoid. Now, I mean, you're not going to cut a nib in half with a razor blade. I know that, but I mean, it is a very sharp tool, right? So it's also a little bit more dangerous. There are people who don't use shims like this. They use the types of shims that are used in, I want to say, the adjustment of spark plugs in cars. I really don't know much about cars, so I can't go into detail. I may be botching this, but I think they come in very similar thicknesses like these shims do. So that's an option, but that's also, I think that is metal, because I don't foresee like 0.0001 of an inch plastic. I think that would be very fragile. Anyway, I'm about to sneeze. No. Control your body. Now, alternatives. Yes, as I said, there are alternatives. There is a trick that Salman of the Toronto Pen Company taught me at some point, where you kind of pull very gently on the shoulders of the nib. That can work. If I have a cheap nib, and this is something you really do at your own risk, if I have a cheap nib, sometimes I take it out and I push it down a bit like that, and that opens up the tines. That is a very easy thing to get wrong. You may have more pressure in one tine than the other. This is exaggeration, but you would get something like this. That's not very good. So here is the solution I have found, by far the most effective solution. Send your nib to a nibmeister. And I'm not being flippant or annoying, but they know what they're doing. And they can increase the flow on nib with their eyes closed. Yes, you will pay, but if you stick with a good nibmeister, you'll also get a nib that writes exactly the way you want it. And to me, that's worth the money. Again, on an inexpensive pen, I don't mind fiddling a bit, but if it's an expensive pen, I've seen enough things go wrong with nibs over the years for me to say I just don't anymore. If it's expensive, a pen that's valuable, whatever, it's not necessarily the same thing, right? Then I send it to a nibmeister. Okay, I have the feeling this is going to be a long one. What criteria do you have, this is again summarized a bit, for picking an ink, like at work? For example, color, drying time, etc. I can answer that question very briefly. I only have one criteria for ink, and that is that it should not destroy my pen. I have talked about this a lot of times in the past, so I will be brief about that aspect of this. I want an ink for my pens that is safe, that I have faith in, and that ends up not destroying my pen. And that means that I tend to stick to certain brands of ink. Never had issues with Waterman, never had issues with Diamine, never had issues with Mont Blanc, and those are the main brands that I use. Oh, Schaefer, by the way, also very good. Never had issues with Schaefer. I hate their green because I don't think it's green. What do you think of Schaefer green? I think it's more like a teal. It's an odd color. Anyway, Diamine has like 700 million colors now, so you have a lot of options. But even Waterman, Mont Blanc, and Schaefer combined, you have a pretty nice set of basic colors. I'm going to be honest. I don't care about like super sheeny special ink that looks like a rainbow. Like I don't care. Your mileage may vary. I do not judge this. All I'm saying is you asked me about my preferences. These are my preferences. Safety. Beyond that, yes, I look for certain things. I like an ink that shades. I don't care about sheen. Personally, I definitely hate shimmer. That's really not for me. Again, this is not a value judgment. I'm just saying I don't care for shimmer. So that's what I do, and that's what I have. These are the kinds of decisions I make. Now, when it comes to work, I have a 4-pen case. I'm sorry for being a bit sniffly. I came from outside. It's April, but it was -3 this morning. I went for a walk, and so I feel a little, I'm sorry. I'll blow my nose for the next video. I have this 4-pen case. I've had this for a long time. A long time. And it has, this is what I take to work, and it has 4 pens. And right now it looks, because everyone wants to know, a cross Darth Vader, a Ben Walsh, I forget what this particular model was like, but it was something like the blue pen or something, whatever, like it's a blue pen. I have an LB6, and I have a Conid king size bulk filler. These are pens that I have taken to work for the past, actually the past week, and the Ben Walsh I just inked up. I use them in a professional setting. I have a red pen. I am a college professor, you know, so I mean there are things to grade, although I like to use green for that, but that's a different matter, and more is digital anyway. I happen to have a red this week. I always have a pen with S.B.R.E. Brown. In this case, it's the Conid bulk filler. I have this pen with Leonardo blue, which I really like, and the Cross Darth Vader always has Aurora black. These are fairly conservative colors. And the reason for that is I once was in a situation in Leiden where a colleague had I think a father, was a parent, I think it was her father, passed away. I had to sign the card that was well before e-cards, so an actual paper card, and I only had sort of neon colors in my fountain pens, so I ended up using a ballpoint. And that moment I decided I want to have at least one neutral ink color with me at all times, not because I expect people to die left and right, but simply because you want a professional environment. Alt Papyrus Grün is not always an option. Fario Yellow, or like whatever, like all these super fancy bright colors that people like are simply not always appropriate. For me, for you that may be different, right? So I'm relatively conservative when it comes to those pickings of ink, and that's how I make my decisions. Is it safe? Yes, okay. And the second criterion is, do I like the color? Yes, no, well, no, then I don't buy it. Yes, sure, here we go. And I find that I use maybe 10 inks, and that's it. If that, honestly. I hope that answers your question. The next one was an interesting one as well. From the same person, and what about your criteria for, excuse me, pens and nibs and such? With again a difference between work and home use. I don't distinguish the two. I don't have work pens and home pens, I just use my pens. So I don't really make that distinction. What I will say is some nibs are not practical at work. If I have to, like I have, who doesn't? But I mean, I have to fill out forms once in a while, student transfers, whatever. That doesn't work well with a triple broad when you have this much space to write something in. So I try. There was a time, let me put it that way, there was a time that I always bought the broadest nib I could, the double broads and the triple broads, and they're a lot of fun, but they're not always practical. So for me, I have come to learn the use of finer nibs, and actually, to be honest, I always forget what I have in this Darth Vader, because it writes like a fine, but I think it is a medium. Yeah, it is a medium, but Japanese medium. So Darth Vader writes like a fine. The Ben Walsh pen has a fine. The LB6 has a medium that writes like a fine. And then there is the double broad, because you have to have a little bit of fun once in a while. But I find that practical, and I don't really say, well, at work I always have a medium nib, or always have this, the other. But beyond what I just said, I try to always have at least a fine nib at hand for pragmatic reasons, and that's it. I do want pens that write properly. If they skip a lot, that doesn't work. And then C, point one, they go to a nibmeister, they get taken care of. So they have to write, and I understand there are certain considerations, like if you go to a lot of meetings, you may want to have a larger ink capacity. Sure, but I mean, if you have a meeting where you finish a full converter, then that has been a very long meeting or a very broad nib, right? It's quite a lot of writing, which I'm sure some people do and are in those kinds of meetings. Like if you're taking 5 classes a day and you're taking notes, then yeah, sure. Excuse me. So that matters, but that's not really a consideration I have. I just pick the pens that I fancy using that week or 2 weeks or whatever, and then I write with them until they're empty, and I pick out another one that I want to use at that point. So that's fairly nonchalant, but that's like me. I just make things up as I go. Okay, final question. This was a good one, I thought, that I responded to fairly briefly on Facebook Messenger, and I apologize if that message came across as a bit curt. It certainly wasn't meant as something curt, but the question was a good one and a valid one, and I thought I would save it for a consult the doctor, so I hope I haven't offended you with the short answer. Here's the long answer. I'm already at 16 minutes. My God! Okay. The story was basically this. So there are pen companies that make their own nibs, and there are those that don't. And what I don't understand, the person who asked the question said was, why would anyone spend a lot of money on a pen that uses a stock B.R.E or a JoWo nib when you have these other companies that make their own nibs? Like, for example, who would pay, say, $100 for a pen with a JoWo nib? And the other question was, are B.R.E and JoWo nibs as good as nibs from the Japanese big 3 makers of the Sailor Platinum Pilot? Okay. Here's how I feel about that. I'm not bothered. As long as the nib writes. And that's not always the case. There was a time that Visconti made its own nibs, and the Palladium nibs sucked. Because at some point, I remember a specific period when I was sent a lot of Viscontis to review, and most of them did not work. So I can't say, well, if you make your own nib, then you have a high quality nib, and if you don't, then you don't. I can't make that statement. Now, if I remember correctly, Visconti didn't technically make its own nibs, but had B.R.E make their nibs for them to their specifications, but I could have that wrong. It's a long time ago. All I'm trying to say is, I don't necessarily think there is a one-to-one correspondence with making your own nib and the quality. Pelikan makes their own nibs. I've seen a lot of over-polished Pelikan nibs. Montblanc makes their own nibs. I've seen a lot of over-polished Montblanc nibs. B.R.E nibs, in my experience, stock B.R.E nibs that have not been modified in any way. If you hear weird knocking, I'm sorry. There's a very hard wind, and the fan over my stove, like through the walls, starts to flap. It's really weird. It's not haunted or anything. Like, it's the spirit of Saint Nibius coming around. B.R.E I found to be a little drier, typically. JoWo I found to be a little wetter, typically. There are obvious exceptions. What I will say is, if anything, I think on the whole, and I'm talking hundreds of pens that I have reviewed over more than a decade, probably I had most issues with Visconti nibs, followed by stock B.R.E nibs on pens that often had tines that were so close together they were very dry. And that's kind of the story. Many nib makers who make their own nibs, and I don't have an exhaustive list here, but think of something like Aurora. I don't recall a lot of issues with Aurora nibs. That is certainly true. I don't recall a lot of issues with Sailor nibs. I've definitely had issues with Platinum nibs. So I find it very difficult to answer the final question of, are Bock and Jovo nibs as good as nibs from the big three Japanese companies? I think there are definitely differences between the nib qualities of the big three Japanese companies. Sailor, to me, is the most pleasant of those three companies. Other people will have different opinions. I remember the Pilot Custom 823 that had a horrible nib that I reviewed and that skipped continuously. So, I mean, there's always one, right? And that's why we have to be careful with drawing such conclusions. Like, you have one exemplar to base your opinion on. But as I said, like, on the whole of having used hundreds of them, that's what I would say. I don't believe I can say in good faith Japanese nibs are made with more care than Bock nibs. Yes, it is true that Bock nibs are very mass produced. That's what Bock does. They make nibs, right? So they churn them out by a lot a day. But is that very different for Platinum? Is it really different? I mean, I don't think, and I could be wrong, but I mean, I don't think they have like one old nibmeister in service who hand makes every single Pilot nib, or Platinum nib, or Sailor nib. It's different for the Sailor specialty nibs. That's a different story. But I'm talking stock nibs, right? So the fine, medium broads, the extra fine, maybe the double broads in the world, like that kind of stuff. So I don't know. Now, that was the more pragmatic aspect of that question that I know I haven't really answered, but I can't answer it. I don't know if I can make that statement, if one is made with more care than the other. What I will say is, what about spending your money on an expensive pen that has that nib? Well, I spent quite a bit of money on this LB6. And it has a Bock nib. It's just the, what is it, the 380, I think, the number 8 nib with an ebonite feed. I do not feel that I have been ripped off. Well, I mean, it's a very expensive pen, so I probably should feel a little ripped off because that's just the way it is. Like, it's just these, in that segment, you are not paying like penny for penny for the material or craftsmanship. There are other factors involved, but that's beyond the scope of this question. It has a Bock nib, and I did send it to a nibmeister. I wanted it tuned to my specifications, and now it's a wonderful writer. Am I upset that that has a Bock nib and not a classic Pens or Lambrou Pens made nib? I've never lost sleep over it. I really haven't. And I have some pens that have nibs that were made in-house. And to be frank, I have a lot of pens that have Bock and Jovo nibs, and I'm not bothered. I'm not bothered. Now, I fully understand the reasoning of if I'm spending a lot, then I want the feeling of exclusivity, and I want my nib to be made in-house. But that I have spent another Consult the Doctor question on. Look at my website for an index. But I mean, I have answered the question before of should pen companies make their nibs in-house, and I don't see why. I don't see it. I understand and I can sympathize with the reasoning of if I'm spending this much, then everything has to be prime quality and not something stock, etc. But if the quality of the stock product is good, is on par with what is made by the pen company itself, or in some cases is better, I don't see what the issue is. I can certainly sympathize with the idea, but I do not have that issue. And other people do, but I don't. This was a very long episode, 24 minutes. I'm sorry for going on for so long, but I hope I haven't bored you. This was, I thought it was very interesting. These were very interesting questions to me. I hope this was useful. If you have questions, please leave them below. And it may take me a little while to get to them, but I do try to get to them all. So please leave questions if you want to. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your support over the years. I feel I don't say that enough, but it means a lot to me. And I'll come back to that in the next episode of Consult the Doctor. So stay tuned. Thanks a lot. Stay safe. And I'll gladly see you later. Bye.